This all started because my husband Nathan and I decided to take a trip for our wedding anniversary. As of a few weeks ago, we've officially been married a year. We've been together for 7, and it's been the best years of my life. Before meeting him, I never thought I would find love. I was sure I would die unmarried, maybe adopt a few kids, but never did I imagine I would be where I am now, married for a year and thinking about children. Or at least, that's where I was before our trip. A few months before our anniversary, I suggested we take a weekend trip. Just the two of us. We'd taken trips together before, but not as husband and wife, aside from our honeymoon. Nathan loved the idea, and both of us were really excited about it. Since we've gotten married, our relationship has only continued to blossom and grow, and I fall more in love with him every day. He's always patient, understanding, kind, and all of the things I've always wanted in a life partner. Like I said, we were planning to start trying to grow our family soon, so taking a trip now while we could just bask in each other seemed like a good idea. Neither of us had a huge preference for where to go. We're from a decently large city in a state that's otherwise insignificant, and trying to find nice vacation spots not too far from here can be difficult. We also wanted to go to a place we'd never been to before, which only made it more of a challenge. 5 or 6 different states were thrown around before my husband finally threw out the Appalachian Mountains. Truly, I think he brought up the idea more for me than for himself. I'm a fan of things that are known to have an element of creepiness to them, hence being a fan of no sleep, and I've mentioned stories about what could be lurking out in the Appalachian Mountains to him before. I quickly grew excited at the idea of being in an unknown, unusual place together. We decided to go to West Virginia since it was the closest state to us that Appalachia runs through. I'll start looking up places to stay at, I suggested, already typing away on my phone. Nathan paused. I was thinking maybe we could camp out. I immediately froze up. Camping in the Appalachian Mountains seemed a little hardcore, even for me. My husband, on the other hand, loves camping and has been begging me to try it ever since we started dating. I've never camped before because it doesn't sound like my idea of fun. I like the outdoors enough, but I tend to hate what comes with it: bugs, bears, and the overall lack of convenience since you do not have technology or utilities that something like a hotel would. Regardless, he was meeting me halfway by suggesting Appalachia, so I didn't immediately tell him no. Let me do some research, I said. I quite literally Googled, is it safe to go hiking in the Appalachian Mountains? There were some general warnings about how to stay safe from wildlife, strangers, and what to do in any case of emergency, but nothing flat out said it was a bad idea. In fact, the Appalachian Mountains website claimed it was safer than most other places. Looking back now, I can see how they're not the most reliable source, but at the time it all looked good to me, so I told him yes. It was the biggest mistake I've ever made. We picked a fairly popular camping site near a national park. I know you may be thinking how so far our decisions seem to be on the more naive side of things, but I promise we did our due diligence. We researched the wildlife, the temperatures, the overall environment. Everything you could think of that seemed logical and rational. Although we both heard about the supernatural, scary things of Appalachia, he took it with a grain of salt. I'm much more of a believer, but I also suffered from the complex that nothing bad would actually happen to me, a rookie mistake. The drive up to West Virginia was calm enough. It took us 3 hours to get there, and we arrived around noon. The campsite was pretty busy, making us feel more at ease. The weather was gorgeous for this time of year, and we were ready to take advantage of it. We set up camp, my husband taking lead on the tent, while I worked on hanging up tomorrow's snacks from a nearby tree to keep it safe from wildlife while we explored. Truthfully, our first day was non-eventful, yet nothing short of amazing. We didn't do much, just walked around the park and campsite a bit, getting comfortable and familiar with the area. We were both pretty tired, so around dinner time, we came back and Nathan started a fire for us to cook our hot dogs and s'mores. Although I was reluctant about camping, this felt right. Just us and nature, and good old-fashioned food that could be cooked with fire and nothing else. I am a teacher, so the stress of my job gets to me easily, and this was the perfect way to distress. Nathan works construction, so his job isn't easy either, and he was enjoying this even more than I was. After dinner, we put the fire out, cozied up in our tent, and drifted off. I remember thinking to myself that if our entire time here was like this, then it would be the perfect trip. The next day is when things started to go downhill. Not right away, of course. The day started beautifully. We could feel the brightness of the sun through the tent as we woke up, could hear the birds chirping, could smell other campers cooking up breakfast. We followed suit, him starting to heat up some beans while I grabbed some bread from our DI tree line. We ate, relaxed for a bit, and then in the early afternoon we prepared for our first hike of the trip. Hiking has been a huge part of Nathan and I's relationship. It was even our first date, so we're both pretty seasoned hikers, and we felt comfortable doing a 5-mile hike to start off our day. The trail difficulty level was hard, but it was nothing we'd never done before, so we had no worries. Water and snacks were packed, and we set off. Again, it was breathtaking, and we were lulled into a false sense of security, much like the rest of our trip so far. The only peculiar thing was how empty this particular trail seemed given how busy the campsite was. But we chalked it up to the length and difficulty and carried on. About a mile in is when things got significantly weirder. We were coming up a more uphill part of the trail, and where it started to level out, Nathan noticed something I wish he hadn't. Straight ahead, behind a few rocks, were ivory white bones. I didn't take another step as we simultaneously noticed them. "Nate, what is that?" I asked. Although unsure of the answer aside from bones, I didn't actually want to know more. Whatever kind of bones they were, they could stay there. My husband felt differently. "Oh, cool," he said, ever excited about these kinds of things, and rushed towards it. I tried to yell at him to stop, but he was already right in front of them. "I think it's a deer carcass." "Holy shit, babe, you gotta see this." I kept my distance. You know I have a weak stomach. I would rather not. The bones wouldn't upset my stomach as much as the thought of how they got there, but I didn't want to see more of them regardless. I was into creepy things, but this wasn't creepy to me, just gross. In contrast, while Nathan wasn't a huge horror buff, he had a passion for biology, and this was something of interest to him. He reached out to touch the mysterious bones, and my insides churned. "Nate, do not. Come on. We have a long way to go, and I want to get back before the sun sets." I crossed my arms tight across my chest, an unsettling feeling growing stronger by the second. One thing I knew was that you were not supposed to be in the Appalachian woods after dark. That was plastered everywhere on the internet when I did my research. Finally, my husband reluctantly left the carcass, and we continued on. 2 more miles in, and suddenly the app we were using to follow the trail, something we always did for our hikes, wasn't making much sense. We always used the app because you could download hikes, so even if you lost service, you still had access to the trail. We'd used it over 100 times before without issue. But this time, our app was quickly acting like a broken GPS, telling us to turn around every 5 seconds and glitching out completely. It gave me chills down my spine because I knew this wasn't right. This wasn't a service issue or an app issue. This was an issue with the trail itself. "Let's just turn around," I pleaded as time dragged on. "The app's not making any sense, and if we keep going, we're only going to get lost." Nate shook his head. "If we turn back, we have 3 miles back to camp. If we keep going, we only have 2 miles. Turning back will take longer, and you're the one who wants to make it back by sunset." Unfortunately, he was right. We were more than halfway through, and turning back would have meant a longer track. Feeling conflicted, I checked the time. It was nearly 3 p.m. That didn't make any sense to me. We hiked 3 miles, which usually took us about an hour at the pace we were going. It had been nearly 3 hours, meaning we would have spent an hour on each mile. There was just no way that was true, nor did it feel like we'd been out here that long. Something snapped in me as I realized more and more the situation we were in. Or I do not know what to do. We just have to get back, I croaked out in a defeated tone. Nathan calmly grabbed my shoulders. "Cass, we're going to be okay. It's not too far now. We'll make it back before dinner for sure. Let's just keep going. Fuck the app. We're experienced enough to know how to read trail markers." Putting it like that eased my nerves a bit. He was right. Trail markers weren't hard to follow if done correctly. And even if we continued at the pace we were at, we'd still make good enough time to make it back to camp before dark. I stopped for a moment, breathing in and appreciating this moment with the love of my life and his ability to bring me peace. "You're right. I am sorry. Thank you." And we continued on, him taking the lead. Things were fine for another mile, but when we only had one left, I noticed it was growing darker already. That couldn't be right. At most, it should be 4, and this time of year the sun starts setting around 6. Nathan didn't seem to notice, so I glanced at my phone. 5:33. "Nate, what the fuck?" I mustered out. He paused and turned back to look at me. "What?" "It's nearly 6. For the first time on this hike, he started to look concerned. "How is that possible?" I shrugged my shoulders, showing him my phone. Then, to my surprise, he chuckled. "It's 5:3, Cass. It's not nearly 6 yet. Come on, let's just keep going so we can make it back. If we speed up, a 30-minute mile is more than doable." I refrained from mentioning that none of this should have taken as long as it had, that there was no way 4 miles should have taken this many hours, but he already knew that. I felt like continuing to complain would have only wasted our time and energy, so I followed along, but my legs were starting to hurt, and I wanted nothing more than to be done. As I mentioned, we're experienced hikers, and no hike had ever made me feel so exhausted before, and we'd hiked 8 miles in 3 hours. I wrote it off as mental exhaustion more than anything. As we finally were on the last half mile of the hike, making extraordinary time in comparison the past 4 or 5 miles, the trail markers led us directly in front of a cave. My heart dropped as my eyes shot holes into my husband's skull. "Why are we in front of a cave?" I asked, knowing the answer yet not wanting to admit that we had to go through this hell-ish looking black hole before finally reaching freedom and safety. Again, my husband was nonchalant about it. "It's a super short walk through the cave, baby. Then it leads right back to camp. I thought I told you about it when I suggested this hike. Look, it's totally safe," he said as he pointed to a sign in front of the cave that said there were no bears, and it was a part of the trail. I've truthfully never wanted to hurt my husband before, but this made every part of my body twitch, as he, in fact, did not mention the cave. "You know I'm claustrophobic." He nodded. "We went through a cave when we hiked in Ohio, though. You seemed fine." I couldn't resist huffing and puffing. I ran out of there so fast I nearly fell and broke my ankle. Nate grabbed my hand and grinned, releasing some of my fear. "Yeah, like a badass. This is nothing. You have been in a cave before, now you know what to expect." Always the optimist, my husband. Truthfully though, it was out of character for him to be quite as chirpy as he was being, but I figured he was trying to stay positive for the both of us since I was pretty close to breaking down. Very reluctantly, we walked into the cave, which we had to duck down to be in since it was so short. I shut my eyes tight and grabbed my husband's hand. "I do not know if I can keep my eyes open in here without throwing up," I warned as we started our walk across the narrow rocks that lay at the floor of the cave. He gripped my hand tight. "I can be your eyes, but be extra careful where you step. Some of these rocks are no joke." The walk through the cave, although terrifying, was not unusual. He was right. It was a short amount of time before he nudged me to let me know he could see the exit, and that we were almost finished with this excruciating exercise that was supposed to be relaxing. I opened my eyes to see the exit, and to see the sun quickly setting as well, making me pick up my pace. He followed suit, feet crunching loudly against the rocks. "Your shoes are loud," I complained as we moved ahead. He looked over at me, confused. "I thought that was you." "Great. That isn't a creepy thing to hear in a cave as the sun sets." I didn't bother thinking too hard about it, moving closer to the exit. My husband didn't share that sentiment, turning his head to look behind him. "Holy shit, there's a deer in here." Goosebumps raced up on my arms and legs, despite the fact that I was sweating, and I reached over to grab his hand without looking behind me. "We've seen deer, Nate. It's nothing too interesting, let's go." But the things I saw on TikTok made me think maybe there was no deer behind us. I only saw one person say they saw what they called a non-deer in the Appalachian forest, charging right for them. But one was enough to make me want to shit my pants up. I didn't know much about deer, but I didn't think a rocky, dark cave seemed like their ideal habitat. I do not know what kind of deer this is, but it doesn't look like the ones we see back home," Nate went on, and I could tell by the way his voice echoed off the cave walls that his head was still turned to face the creature as I pulled him along. "Nate, stop," I warned, not feeling like I could say much else until we got the hell out of here. But just as I said that, I heard the loud hooves on the rock increase their pace, and it no longer sounded like something I could write off as Nate's loud hiking shoes. "Run," I said to my husband with urgency, not letting go of him as the sound behind us picked up. I'm not sure if I dragged Nathan across those rocks or if his feet carried themselves, but it didn't matter. We had to get out of here, and not just the cave, the forest. We had to get back to camp. "Cassie?" I heard his confusion, but I couldn't stop. We couldn't stop. It was right behind us, moving fast. The sound hadn't let up. I finally reached the exit of the cave, but didn't let my feet slow down, or Nate's, as I continued pulling him, grabbing him tighter than ever before. "Cass," he exclaimed again. There was no time to answer him. Once out of the cave, I couldn't hear the footsteps coming from behind us anymore, but that didn't mean they weren't there. I didn't look back once, all the way up until we reached our tent. Once we got there, I finally let my head whip back towards him. I would never seen the look on Nate's face that I was seeing now. He was gasping for air, a sound I hadn't been able to notice before we stopped running, and thankfully the deer or non-deer or whatever the hell was not behind him. I checked my phone to see it was past 6 now, and the sun had almost fully set. "What the fuck just happened?" he asked through gasps. My husband is a fit man, and the small run we just did would not have winded him so easily, but I thought he may pass out for a second, so I pulled him onto the ground to sit. "I do not know. I do not want to know, but it wasn't a deer." Looking at me, eyes clouded with fear, he asked me if I saw it. I shook my head, knowing he did, and asked what he saw. It was the biggest deer I've ever seen in my entire life. If we weren't in West Virginia, I would have thought it was a moose. "It wasn't a deer," I reminded him. "I think it was sick. Something looked off about it. That's because it wasn't a deer." He didn't believe in this stuff like I did, so he looked at me like I was crazy. "What was it then?" "I do not know, Nate, but you're really gonna sit here and tell me that was a deer chasing us down for half a mile?" My husband didn't reply, still working on catching his breath. We both sat in silence for a while, processing everything. I didn't even want to be here anymore. What happened was enough for me to be ready to go home, but I knew the feeling wasn't mutual. After a while, I got off the ground and walked towards our tent. "I am going to bed. I am not hungry for dinner." I didn't wait for a reply as I walked into our tent, zipped it up, and changed into my pajamas. Half of me thought Nate may at least try to come after me, but the other half thought he was probably too starving to do anything other than eat. I felt so sick to my stomach that any food that went down would surely come right back up, and I had an aching headache that only sleep could cure. So I unzipped my sleeping bag and tried to push all the horrible thoughts out, so we could finally get to the security that was daylight. It worked for a few hours. I do not know what time it was when I woke up, but I assume it was late. Nate was next to me, snoring softly. I could hear the sound of rain outside the tent, but even worse, I could feel it ever so slightly dripping on my arm. I looked up and there was a small gash in our tent, like someone had taken a pocket knife and just barely scratched the top of our tent with it. Enough to make a hole, but not big enough to notice, just by a quick glance. I sat up straight and watched the water pour in, and then looked down to see a puddle already pooling. I wondered how long the rain had been pouring for, and gently I shook Nate awake. He was a heavy sleeper, but after a minute of shakes and whispers, he was finally gaining consciousness. "Nate, Nate, it's raining through the tent." "What?" He was still groggy. "There's a hole in the tent. Rain is getting through." He was still confused and half asleep as he looked up to see the hole nearly right above where I was lying. "That's weird," was all he said at first. "Yeah, I know. There's a puddle in the tent too. I do not know how long it's been raining for, but it's been raining since you went to sleep. Really. But that hole was not in the tent when I came to bed," he insisted. "It's been raining for that long?" I questioned with the raise of an eyebrow. "How did you eat if you couldn't start a fire?" "I ate like 10 protein bars." He continued to mumble. "What do we do? I can't sleep like this. The tent is basically ruined. My husband seemed to contemplate this as he continued waking up. Let's go sleep in the car. In the morning I can patch up the hole and clean out the water. I didn't like that answer at all, but I knew I wouldn't like any option right now. The last thing I wanted was to step out of this tent in the pitch black while it rained on us. I do not think there would be any more vulnerable feeling than that. What if we just went back to sleep and left in the morning? I do not want to go out there right now. My very rational husband looked at me with bug eyes. Are you crazy? We'll get sick sleeping in cold rain. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. I can't do this, Nate. I am scared. There's nothing to be scared of, Cassie. We're okay, we just need to get to the car and go back to sleep. Just then, a loud scream sounded from the woods behind us. It was blood-curdling, and it sounded like nothing I would ever heard before. It didn't sound like a man or a woman, like a kid or an adult, or like anything I could possibly pinpoint. Just a scream, out in the vacant woods, yet still reaching us too close for my liking. I curled my body up. Nathan, we are not okay. I am not going out there. The scream even shook him up a bit, and he pulled me into his arms. Okay, baby. I understand. Let's just stay up and try to avoid the rain. It'll only be a few hours until daylight, and then we can get out of here. Relief washed over me that he finally seemed to understand the gravity of things, that we couldn't stay here, but we couldn't leave yet, either. We sat there for about an hour, clinging to each other with damp skin, as we piled up our sleeping bags, to try and keep us from sitting in the rainwater that had trickled in. To make me feel better, Nathan talked about our wedding. How beautiful I looked in my dress. How magical our first dance was. How our wedding night was even better. He talked about how he hoped our first child was a girl. How he hoped she was as beautiful as I was, even though he knew she would be. He talked of all the things he knew made my heart flutter in the complete opposite way that this place did, trying to calm me down and take my mind off of all the strangeness here. It was working too. I felt serenity overtaking me as we moved on to the topic of baby names. Something we'd talked about before, but only briefly. When we started to hear the scratches, on the back of the tent directly behind us, it sounded like somebody was taking 10 sharp knives and dragging them down the nylon material. We both froze, not daring to look behind us. At first we didn't acknowledge it, just paused to make sure it didn't continue before resuming our conversation. But it wasn't even 5 minutes later that it happened again. Okay, this is ridiculous, Nate said, unraveling himself from me and moving towards the front of our sanctuary. What are you doing? I asked in a panic. Whatever the fuck is going on, I am sick of it. Look at you, you're worried out of your mind. It's probably just an animal. I rolled my eyes and reached out to grab him. Even if it is an animal, what are you gonna do? If a bear is standing behind our tent right now, you're just gonna go out there and ask it to go away. What are you thinking? This seemed to drag him back to reality, and he sat back down beside me, but scooted us both away from the back of the tent where the loud scratches were coming from. We waited for a minute, but no scratches continued, so we kept talking. I like talking about our future. I always had, even months into our relationship, because he always talked about it with so much certainty. He knew we'd always be together, that we'd have 2 kids in a house with a picket fence and a golden retriever to match. He believed it so strongly that it made any doubts I ever had diminish very early on in our relationship, despite the fact that I was rather cynical when I met him. We moved on to what kind of house we'd get when we had enough to move from our dreaded apartment. He wanted a modern home, and I wanted us to have a gazebo in the backyard, a big one that our entire family could sit under. Just as we were fake arguing about what color the living room walls would be, I wanted tan while he preferred yellow. We heard the faintest whispers coming from either side of us. We quieted our own conversation to try and hear better, but at this point, neither of us were surprised at the persistence of whatever was out there. However, as the whispers grew louder, we became pretty confident it wasn't a bear. At first I thought maybe the whispers were talking about food. I thought I heard bacon, and so maybe it was just some hungry campers that were rising extra early to eat. But as the volume increased, it was clear that wasn't it. I was still struggling to make out what was being said, but as Nathan tightened his grip on me and I looked over to see him nearly in tears, I started to put it together. Nathan, that whisper was crystal clear, even over the rain, and sounded like it was right in our ears. My eyes widened as I realized what was happening. My mind flashed back to all the Reddit threads I looked over, all the videos I watched, and they all contained warnings about hearing your name in the mountains, about how you never react and you never respond. But my husband didn't know that, because I truly hadn't thought it was something I would have to tell him, because I never thought it was something we'd encounter. Before I could try to change the subject, do anything to get him not to acknowledge it, he shouted in a way I would never heard, "Leave us the fuck alone. Never know, Dorer." He thrashed around a bit, pushing on the tent as if to signal that he meant business, but I knew he had made the worst possible decision. The whispers stopped, along with every other sound in the woods. It was too quiet now, to the point of an eeriness that was almost worse than the whispers were. I shook my head feverishly at him, as if to tell him not to say another word. He didn't seem to understand. "It's okay, baby. This thing's not gonna keep messing with us." I began to cry as he kept talking, quickly bringing one hand up to cover his mouth, and forming a single finger with the other, and putting it over my lips, urging him to be silent. As I did this, I wondered if it was too late. Everyone said not to acknowledge the name calling, but nobody ever said what would happen if you did. I tried to think on my feet, moving my hands to take both of his. "You know what, baby? I am tired. It's only an hour or two before daylight. Why do not we just take a nap? A little water won't hurt us," I urged, both of us crying at this point, although not heavily. He shook his head, but I only nodded mine, laying the both of us down. "Please," I whispered as I began playing with his hair and trying to get him to calm down. I truly do not know how, but after what felt like an eternity of sitting there with no more scary incidents, we both managed to doze off. I think we were so mentally exhausted at that point that there was nothing else to do. I am not sure how long I slept for, but I know it was well past sunrise when I finally got up. Nathan wasn't next to me, and the tent was freezing cold, water covering almost all of me. I quickly unzipped the tent and dashed out, hoping my husband was cooking us a much-needed breakfast before we got the hell out of there. But he wasn't. All of his stuff was still there, meaning he couldn't have gone far. So I started walking around and frantically calling his name. Just as I was about ready to call the police, he emerged from the woods, walking rather slowly. I ran up to him and embraced him. "What the fuck are you doing?" I was looking for other campers. I wanted to ask if they experienced what we did last night. I didn't even care how stupid that was in that moment, because half of me thought he was gone forever. So I cherished the moment before turning to look at him. "Can we please leave?" I begged, pulling back from the hug but not letting go of him all the way. He smiled at me. I've never been more ready for a vacation to end in my life. We both laughed and packed up faster than we ever had before, throwing away the shitty broken tent and racing to the car. In that moment, I felt so much relief, so much love for my life and for my husband, so lucky to be back in our car and heading to our tiny box of an apartment. My husband offered to drive, so I slept almost the entire way home. I was so caught up in the joy and rush of getting out that I ignored a few things I really shouldn't have. It wasn't until we were back home and started to settle back in that these things started to register. First, it was that my husband's fingers were longer than I remembered, his ring hardly fitting anymore. I asked him about the ring, and he said he lost weight on our trip since he barely ate. That didn't make much sense to me, but I didn't press it. He also seemed weirdly taller. He was never a tall guy, although taller than me, but now he seemed at least 6 feet tall. I was too nervous to ask him about that, so I let it go. He was also acting a bit strange, not as calming and affectionate as normal, and was much shorter and dry when we had conversations. I jokingly brought up our talk about what color our living room walls would be, again saying that a tan color would be nice. This time he agreed with me. Maybe I could have chalked those things up to whatever and let it be. Maybe I could have let it go and moved on. But when he went back to work that Monday, his start time being a few hours earlier than mine, I decided to finish unpacking for him. Normally he was quick to unpack while I lingered, leaving my bag there a few days. But this time it was the opposite. I had never unpacked faster, wanting to get rid of any memory of our trip from hell, but he said he just didn't have the energy. I figured since I had some extra time that morning, I would just help out and he'd have a pleasant surprise when he got off work. As I was pulling his clothes out, tucked between a t-shirt and pajama pants, was his notebook. He kept a notebook with him when we traveled, to jot down interesting things for when we didn't have our cell phones to commemorate, so I didn't think too much of it. However, I had this strong nagging feeling in me to look in it. Curiously, I picked it up and opened to the last page. I do not have much time. I can hear them calling me again. It's getting louder. I swear I saw claws coming through the hole in the tent. Cassie, if you're reading this, I likely didn't make it back. I know you would tell me not to go out there, to leave it alone and go back to sleep, but I can't. They're coming for me. I do not go check it out. I fear they'll come for you too. I do not know what it is, but I can feel it hunting me. It's angry. I love you so much. I want nothing more than to have our future together, just the way we planned it. But if I can't have one, there's no sense in dragging you down with me. I really hope I come back to you.